Hello and welcome back to Foreign Correspondents. I'm Somi Sorang, and joining me here in the studio today is our panel of foreign journalists. Welcome to the program.
Good to be back again.
Thank you very much.
The three-way encounter between South Korean President Moon Jae-in, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and US President Donald Trump has grabbed headlines across the world, catching many observers by surprise.
트럼프 대통령이 대담한 제안에 따라서 역사적인 만남이 이루어졌습니다.
난 앞으로 아빠와 이런 훌륭한 관계가 남들이 예상 못하는 그런 계속 좋은 일들을 계속 만들면서
And it's just an honor to be with you, and it was an honor that you asked me to step over that line, and I want to thank you. It's been great. It's been great.
So on this week's edition of Foreign Correspondents, we sit down with our panel of journalists to take a closer look at the details of that historic DMZ encounter and how the regional powers are perceiving the meeting. On June 30th, the world witnessed a historic rendezvous between the leaders of the two Koreas and the US at the DMZ. Those tuning into the live broadcast were treated to many memorable moments at the impromptu meeting. So what were some of the most memorable moments for you at that three-way meeting?
Well, I think probably the first big moment was when Trump stepped into the North Korean side of the DMZ. That was something that we saw last year when President Moon obviously met with Kim Jong-un in April. But the significance of an American president stepping foot in North Korean territory is obviously huge. The fact that the meeting was arranged at such last minute, that it came after a tweet by Trump the day before, was obviously remarkable as well. And of course, the fact that after months and months and months of almost nothing happening between the US and North Korea, we had this sudden explosion of like good vibes and the two leaders shaking hands and speaking warmly of each other. And of course, Moon Jae-in just standing there in the middle, clearly chuffed to bits that this had happened.
And for you, Kelly?
Yeah, I think, that historic handshake was obviously really exciting. I look forward to seeing some kind of play-by-play as to what exactly happened between Trump and Kim Jong-un during that 50-minute sit-down, as well as President Trump and President Moon.
Okay, any disappointing moments for you, Frank?
Well, for me, I was watching live, and the video cameras that were covering the event weren't really set up like we saw previously, especially in Singapore. And it looked very unprofessional. You had a live microphone beaming, shouts and reprimands from camera operators trying to get their shots. That could have been much better organized.
There was definitely like a clash of culture as well between the American press and the American kind of secret service and the North Koreans, who were just not kind of used to this type of thing and not used to, I guess, dealing with maybe a free press or dealing with a security service that's trying to facilitate that type of coverage as well. I felt the North Koreans were really just trying to protect their guy as much as possible and also make sure that their journalists as well got the best shot, right?
That's another thing that really surprised me, is the proximity that people were allowed to get to the two leaders. The media scrum and the jostling that took place so close to them, I thought was actually quite alarming.
President Donald Trump, he became the first sitting U.S. leader to step foot on North Korean soil since an armistice to end hostilities on the Korean War was signed 66 years ago.
이런 데서 각하를 만나게 될 줄 생각 못했어요.
Good. That's my honor. Would you like me to step across?
각하께서 한 발자국 건너시면 사상 처음으로 우리 땅을 밟으시는 미국 대통령이 되죠.
Trump's security detail was in disarray at the time, and he had no protective measures on him, such as a bulletproof vest. Do you feel that Kim and Trump were somewhat irresponsible in going ahead with this last-minute meeting without the proper diplomatic protocol or security detail?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's probably irresponsible from a security and safety perspective. A lot of experts that I've spoken with in recent months, their big critique of the Vietnam summit, which we all know was a big failure, right, was that it wasn't properly prepared for or planned. Summits are supposed to be this thing where the two leaders get together, they have their photo op, they clink their champagne, and they sign something. And that's not what happened. They ended up negotiating while they were there. Certainly another impromptu, unplanned meeting doesn't help further along the denuclearization process from like a give and take bargaining chip perspective. But I do think that this was necessary to breathe life and momentum back into this, just because it seemed like it was all falling apart for a while there. It is somewhat irresponsible. On the other hand, it seems like it's paying off so far. So we'll just have to see.
Okay.
I don't think it was quite irresponsible in terms as one of the features of this dynamic between the U.S. and North Korea is that top-down approach. If this was left to Pompeo and Bolton, we wouldn't be seeing these negotiations at all. So definitely that top-down approach from President Trump, got to give him credit for opening negotiations that probably wouldn't have happened without that impetus.
So getting the talks back on track.
Sure.
Conservative camp was generally in favor of the US president's visit to Korea, while the liberal camp was widely opposed. And regarding the three-way meeting between Moon, Kim, and Trump at the DMZ, 6 out of 10 South Koreans welcomed the unexpected development.
장기적으로 봐서 우리나라의 평화가 오기를 바라면서 상당히 긍정적으로 생각합니다.
일단 굉장히 역사적이었다고 생각이 들고 또 그러면서 한편도 굉장히 가식적이지 않았나. 그런데 그럼에도 우리나라가 정말 좋은 방향으로 그렇게 나아갔으면 좋겠습니다.
한마디로 쇼반, 진실반이라고 반반 생각하면 되는 거 아닙니까?
비핵화가 돼야 되겠죠. 그게 전제 조건이 되면은 긍정적이겠죠.
미국 현직 대통령이 북한 땅을 밟은 건 또 없었던 일이기 때문에 참 놀랍고 역사적인 일이지만 이게 현실적으로 우리나라에 어떤 영향이 되고 또 어떤 긍정적인 영향이 될지는 조금 더 장기적으로 지켜봐야 될 것 같습니다.
저는 상당히 긍정적으로 보고요. 우리가 지금 6개월한 전쟁 큰 아픔이 있었는데 그런 부분들을 지금 치료할 수 있는 누군가는 치료를 해야 되니까.
So as we just saw, opinions are rather polarized about this DMZ summit. Why do you think that is so?
Well, I think it's really interesting, especially in the conservative camp that's really kind of pro-American. I was out for some demonstrations on the weekend that the summit took place of what are called the Taegukis here in South Korea that really advocate a strong alliance with the United States. And it must be difficult for them to see Donald Trump alongside Kim Jong-un and opening up that dialogue and engaging with North Korea when really their whole sort of right-wing perspective is to demonize North Korea, separate North Korea from South Korea, promote the eventual collapse and change in government of North Korea. So to see Moon Jae-in being a representative of South Korea with the U.S. president and opening this engagement with North Korea that they really dislike a lot.
Media has put out an array of opinions and perspectives following Trump's historic meeting with Kim at Panmunjeom. How's the American public perceiving the meeting?
I think we, as Frank mentioned, we live in these really fascinating times in terms of where people in South Korea are aligning themselves, because even I don't really know what to make of the U.S. position sometimes, right? Because on, the surface level, Trump has, in his words, fallen in love with Kim Jong-un, but then again, we have all of these sanctions and hardline policies against North Korea. One day Trump is highlighting North Korean defector voices, the next he's taking Kim Jong-un's word for it about Otto Warmbier stuff. And so it really does seem like with Trump as president, we really don't know where the U.S. stands and where words meet actions.
Right.
And so it's hard when someone has always kind of just, taken the U.S. stance, because what is the U.S. stance at this point?
Well, if we have a look at North Korea's perception, North Korea's state-run media also reported on the meeting between Kim and Trump. The 노동신문 newspaper, widely read by North Korean citizens, published 35 photographs from the meeting to accompany their story on the historic occasion. In your guess, what might be the average North Korean citizen's opinion on this?
Well, that's been an interesting question throughout this kind of US-North Korea diplomacy, because obviously North Koreans are taught from a very young age that the Americans are their worst enemy, possibly after Japan. The use of certain words to describe Americans in North Korean language is pretty common, even in schools and stuff like that. So it must be confusing for North Koreans to see their leader meeting with President Trump, especially President Trump, who kind of looks like a North Korean caricature of an American. He's like a bombastic figure. He's got a big plume of blonde hair. But then I think, a lot of North Koreans will also see it as their leader kind of bringing the most powerful person on earth to the table, right? They can say, well, look, we're a small, isolated country. We know we have problems, but now, thanks to our leader, we have this nuclear deterrent, this treasured sword, as they call it, and he's actually brought Trump to the table. So I think there's two sides on that. I think it's safe to say there's probably a split. I think the average North Korean probably doesn't think too much of it.
The historic three-way meeting at the DMZ was hinted at in days prior, especially after President Trump tweeted on June 29th that he wanted to meet Chairman Kim Jong-un. And to this, some South Korean media outlets focused on Trump's so-called Twitter diplomacy. Trump took to Twitter once again to express his thoughts about the DMZ meeting after he parted ways with Kim Jong-un. Do you think Trump's tweets played a significant role in making this meeting happen?
I think by him tweeting it out to the world before just contacting the North Koreans first, that certainly puts the, compulsion on North Korea to do something, right? Because exactly. If they ignore it, not a good sign. If they respond, it's a great sign, right? So by doing it so publicly, certainly some kind of movement, some kind of answer was going to happen. So in that sense, yes. Do I think Twitter plays a humongous role in inter-Korean relations or just denuclearization in general? No, but I do think that Twitter for this summit did make this thing happen so quickly, for sure.
And in general, do you think Trump's Twitter activity has yielded a net positive during his tenure?
He tweets some pretty egregious, terrible things, right? But he still has a 45% approval rate in the United States, and certainly news organizations and a lot of the major networks in the U.S. eat up his tweets. His tweets are news, right? And I think last week Frank had mentioned, Trump is a real master of the news. He really knows how to play the media. And so yes, I guess it is a net positive, but it's also a shame that it is sometimes because he uses Twitter to bully and abuse other politicians, to put out, statements that have racist sentiment to it. So I'm certainly not condoning his use of Twitter, but do I think it works for him and his base? Sure, yeah.
All right.
I think Twitter's great. I think it's great that Donald Trump tweets. That way we get insight into what he's really like without having to go through all the filters. And we find out that he's not the nicest person in the world, certainly doesn't have a lot of policies that I would at all agree with. But I want to know about that.
Right.
And by him tweeting openly himself, without, again, going through the handlers that are going to filter out what he really thinks, I think we're all better off. I'd love to see presidents on both sides of the political spectrum and, in the international community do more of that. Then we're more likely to get what they really think.
To Frank's point, I do think that's true. If you look at President Obama's Twitter now and during his term, it really is kind of like clearly someone wrote it for him. It's, there's probably multiple people reading it. It's like almost like just mini press releases and statements. And there's a certain level of dignity and formality to that, but at the same time, absolutely, we're not really, seeing the insides of Obama's mind and seeing how he might act on a personable level, sure.
I think there is a slight danger of having someone with Trump's power and also Trump's temperament being able to just send out messages on a whim, though. We knew that in 2017 he was essentially preparing a tweet where he was going to say that I'm ordering all US dependents to leave the Korean Peninsula, right? And certain advisors to him said, well, the North Koreans would understand that as a declaration of war, essentially, and that he was only prevented from doing that at the last minute when that was explained to him. And the idea that if at any other time he might have just done that without seeking counsel, it's a little bit concerning. But I think now that diplomacy is going well, it kind of helps bypass a lot of the traditional kind of bureaucratic obstacles to this kind of thing. I think if the State Department had been leading the summit, it would have taken weeks and weeks and weeks, and we would have had negotiators going back and forth, deciding what was going to happen. And Trump can just bypass all of that and just say, I want to meet Kim Jong-un, let's meet tomorrow. Which is pretty interesting.
Now, Kelly, as you mentioned, Donald Trump's daughter and White House advisor Ivanka Trump accompanied her father to the G20 summit in Osaka, as well as his summit with President Jae-in, serving as the de facto first lady, according to some observers.
Hopefully, we are at a critical juncture where we have the potential to usher in a time of unprecedented prosperity for the peninsula and, of course, peace, which is our collective goal. And women will play an enormous role in enabling that outcome.
What's your opinion on President Trump's decision to have his daughter accompany him to all these important meetings?
That's a horrible idea. And I share the perspective of Wendy Sherman, who wrote a long piece just a couple days ago for the USA Today. She talked about how under John F. Kennedy, he appointed his brother, Robert Kennedy, as the Attorney General in the United States. 6 years later, the U.S. passed an anti-nepotism statute to prevent that kind of appointment taking place. But the loophole through which the Trumps have maneuvered is that Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner don't receive salaries. They don't receive payment for their work that they do. However, I think diplomatic corps and the president himself to have his daughter take up such a position. It was kind of ridiculous to see the world leaders assembled at the G20 and front and center is Ivanka Trump with Abe on one side, Trump on the other side, and the Canadian Prime Minister and other world leaders behind them.
There was a clip that went around of, I think it was Lagarde, Theresa May, the French President Macron, having a conversation about something, and then Ivanka's kind of just steps in and offers her view, and some of the faces of, Christine Lagarde is obviously French. She's incapable of hiding her emotions and just go, in reaction to this. It's just, I think it's, for the US, it's not great on a world stage to have this kind of nepotism on show, really. It's not really becoming of a modern democracy. It's more of a autocratic state where the leaders, siblings and children kind of follow him around. I'm not sure it's a great look.
As an American, I do find it incredibly embarrassing for the reasons that Frank and Oliver just laid out. And I do think that a lot of Americans share that view. But also, I can't imagine that people are taking this very seriously, So I don't know why the Trump administration is doing it, but I do know that among Trump's base, Ivanka is very much loved for whatever reason, right? So it's a weird thing where, I don't know if it's really upsetting his base. And again, as I mentioned, his approval rating is pretty decent. It's at 45%. So again, views on Ivanka's role in general is split.
Okay, let's now move our discussion on and talk a little bit more about the regional powers and their reactions to the DMZ meeting.
金正恩委员长同特朗普总统共同跨越了南北军事分界线，在板门店举行会晤。朝美韩领导人还进行了友好的会面，这值得欢迎。
At the G20 prior to the DMZ rendezvous, the US and China squared off over trade issues.
American success in the digital economy is based on free flow of data, strong privacy and intellectual property protection, access to capital, and innovation. The United States is committed to sustaining this approach to digital trade.
营造公平、公正、非歧视的市场环境，要促进技术、人员、信息等要素流动。
However, the two sides were able to later agree on a truce in their trade dispute. Aside from matters regarding trade, tariffs, and the economy, the US and China also have overlapping interests in the form of North Korea's denuclearization. Frank, how do you think China feels about the DMZ meeting?
Well, I think they're encouraged by what takes place. At the same time, they want to see a maintenance of the status quo. They don't want to see North Korea get too cozy with the United States. We've seen, previously several meetings between Xi and Kim in the past, many of those preceding the summits. And in this case as well, we had Xi Jinping's visit to North Korea just, I think, a week or two prior to this summit. So there is that kind of concern and management consideration in terms of relations between the U.S. and North Korea. But I think that they would be overall encouraged by what's taking place just within kind of limits that they can oversee.
So although trade tensions between the US and China has somewhat eased following the G20 summit, a new trade war has broken out between South Korea and Japan. 8 months after South Korea's Supreme Court ruled last October that Japanese firms had to compensate the victims of forced Korean laborers during the Second World War, the Tokyo government announced new export restrictions on South Korea on a number of high-tech materials.
일본이 신뢰관계 훼손 등의 불명확하고 WTO 협정상 근거가 없는 이유를 들어가며 일방적으로 한국에 대해서만 수출 통제 조치를 강화한 것은 WTO 제반 규정에 부합하지 않습니다.
How do you think this whole Tokyo trade war will play out in the coming weeks and months?
The tensions are really deep between Japan and South Korea, so it's hard to predict. It certainly seems like it's just ramping up. And I do think that it could serve as a distraction for the Moon government. As it is, Moon is already under a lot of pressure to improve the economy. And, just talking to South Koreans on the street, a lot of them wish that he focus less on the North Korea issue, right? And more on the economy. And right now, South Korea is already faced with the, byproduct of a trade war with China. So, adding a trade war with Japan, it certainly doesn't help this export-driven economy. It certainly will hit headlines and concern South Koreans. And so, I don't know if an end is in sight, but I don't think it's necessarily going to help the optics of the Moon administration or the North Korea issue.
Now let's move on and talk about the Washington-Tokyo alliance, because although it's widely perceived that the Washington-Tokyo alliance is airtight, cracks have emerged in recent weeks after President Trump openly bemoaned the U.S. trade deficit with Japan, as well as a security treaty signed between the two countries in 1951.
I would say that Japan has had a substantial edge for many, many years, but that's okay. But we'll get it a little bit more fair, I think. I think we'll do that.
Do you think Washington-Tokyo ties are still robust?
I think Abe probably felt a little bit embarrassed by kind of getting fully on board with maximum pressure and then Trump kind of giving up on maximum pressure as soon as he met with Kim Jong-un. North Koreans for a long time have been conducting these kind of ship-to-ship transfers of oil, and the Japanese were always the most vigilant in photographing those and publicizing them and saying, look, North Korea is still essentially getting oil illegally. Japanese seem to be toning that down a little bit. There was an interesting editorial in the Choshin Sunbo, which is the newspaper of the pro-North Korean organization in Japan, that said essentially, well, the Japanese haven't offered us anything. So Abe can say that he wants a summit all he wants, but we still have these Japanese sanctions that essentially prohibit a lot of business between the two countries. They said, why should we have a summit with Abe if he still insists on, adhering to this kind of hostile policy against us, which I think is reasonable. You can't really say that you want dialogue and at the same time maintain a kind of, as we said, a kind of, maybe hostile is too strong a word, but a hardline policy, right?
All right. As we have done for the past 2 weeks, if you could wrap up the important points of today's discussion as a news headline, how would you do it, Frank?
Well, the potential of, I guess, a third summit. So I would say Trump-Kim third time lucky with a question mark.
So I would say a good headline would be something along the lines of, distractions ahead of the unplanned Trump-Kim summit. I do think that a summit will happen, but I think that there's a lot going on, like these trade wars, as well as the 2020 election in the United States, and I think there's a good chance that the summit will happen much later than we would like.
Okay.
I think we could say Trump bypasses protocol, gets a summit, what's next? Because I guess we now have the working level negotiations have to go on, and that's where the real contentious issues are going to be discussed, and whether or not another summit happens will be entirely dependent on whether or not those are successful.
All right, guys, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks.
From the G20 summit in Osaka to the Pyongyang, Beijing, and Seoul, Washington summits, the busy diplomatic calendar of June ended with an exclamation mark after the leaders of the two Koreas and the US held a historic three-way meeting at the DMZ. It's hoped that this monumental occasion will lay another foundation for lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula. That's all we have for this week. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye.